Hey guys, so our reading this week was chapters 5 and 6 from the Theories of Human Communication. And so I was just going to talk a little bit about what we read and kind of what I thought about it and how I interpreted it. So chapter 5, we're talking about the conversation. It looks at how, what are the theories surrounding how we conversate with each other and communicate differently. So basic understanding we all have is that we, in all of our cultural norms, we want to reduce anxiety. I know for my paper, I did a little bit of research on Sigmund Freud, and a lot of his theories around incest and how we behave sexually center around first how we reduce anxiety, and that's how we came from it, is being able to understand relationships so sort of in a way that limited how much questioning we had about where they're going or what they mean. So keeping relationships defined as sexual and non-sexual helps limit that anxiety. So that's kind of the first thing that came to mind when I was reading about this theory. And then we look at it on a more micro level as to how it relates in communications in our everyday lives. We can take, for example, the uncertainty theory, uncertainty reduction theory from Berger. And it states that people want to learn more about each other because we want to predict the future and limit uncertainty. We have passive strategies of doing this and active strategies. For example, if I had a new coworker at my work, I would passively look at what she's wearing, how she's speaking, does she have an accent? Those are some things I would observe passively. But if I actively wanted to know more about her, I might ask her where she went to school or how she got here, where her family is from, where she grew up. Those are ways I could actively gain information about her and sort of that would be the building blocks for our conversation, and I would know what to talk about with her. And then you can also look at the accommodation theory as an example of how communications are used in conversation. And this theory was by Howard Giles, and it says we change our behavior when we speak to each other to mimic each other, to make each other feel comfortable. For example, if someone was really close to me speaking face to face, I might also feel comfortable enough to move in closer because they're initiating that. Or if someone's speaking in a more southern accent and I'm from the South, I might turn on a more southern accent because I feel comfortable around them and I want to mimic their behavior in the conversation. Then we look at the sociocultural tradition. In this, we talk a little bit about symbolic interactionism. And this is a theory I was familiar with from my studies in sociology in undergrad. And basically, we find meaning in the symbols and how we perceive them. There aren't necessarily built-in structures as to how we interpret things. We sort of build those structures ourselves by how we attach meaning to different kinds of things. And the way we communicate and relate to each other is in constant flux because we interpret things differently. And this significance in objects kind of reminds me of the new materialist perspective that we were talking about in another class, because it kind of places prevalence on inanimate objects and how they're important not just to humans, but important in their own lives. And another theory we talked about is the symbolic convergence theory by Ernest Borman, John Cragin, and Donald Shields. It also falls under the sociocultural tradition, and we see understanding in symbols from one group echo out into larger groups, and that eventually is how we form our worldviews. I thought that was pretty interesting. And then we also read about conversation analysis, where we see conversations as accomplishments, and we reach goals through conversation. Every conversation has a goal, whether that be to relate to someone, to get to know them, to gain knowledge from them. They all have a goal, and we see them as a way to meet that goal. And then we look at the cybernetic tradition, and then we see the context behind what's being said and how it affects meaning and place in the conversation. When we engage in an interaction, our goal is to reach a point of coordination. And when you're coordinating, it doesn't necessarily mean you're agreeing. It just means your direction of it is being explained, and sort of what you want them to get out of the conversation is being communicated, and there's a sense of understanding. You could be in an argument and be at a point of coordination just because they're understanding what you're saying and your point of disagreement is being interpreted. And often stories help us coordinate better because they put sort of a foundation for the conversation to build off of and grow, as opposed to not giving a context to what you're saying. Then we look at the critical tradition, where we see theories about communicating cross-culturally. And then when we're talking about cross-culturally, a lot of the theories we looked at how you spoke in different cultures and different languages, and also different cultures as a dominant and a minority culture. All communication occurs within cultural frameworks, and all individuals have different kind of knowledge about how to communicate. So often in multicultural societies, there's a one dominant ideology of how to talk. And an example the book gave us was Japanese cultures and how they give a little bit more nonverbal cues, as opposed to Italians that have very verbal, they shout, they yell, the Italian culture, and how different that was from the Japanese culture, where they might have more nonverbal cues with eye contact. And I know they do ceremonial bowing, the tea ceremonies, which are completely silent, and you're communicating with everyone else in the room by how you pass the tea and how you interact with each other through physical touch. And then we also look at the co-cultural theory within this tradition that looks at how minority cultures communicate with a dominant culture. And there has to be an understanding or a common ground in order to negotiate and talk, because there are big differences between these two. And then in the next chapter, we're going to look at the relationship. And this relates to how we build and sustain relationships through communication. In the cybernetic tradition, there are relational patterns of interaction. It talked about the Palo Alto group in California that kind of did a research into how we define our relationships when we communicate. And this could be verbal or nonverbal. For example, if I talk to my coworker and I make fun of her car or what she's wearing or her work is of poor quality, I'm showing her that I want to be dominant over her. And then if she comes back at me and says something equally sort of demeaning, then that was a symmetrical exchange, because we're both equally communicating. Even though it's negative, it's still of equal levels. A complimentary exchange would be if she goes, "Yeah, I guess so," and walks away. Then it shows that I'm dominant and she's a submissive person in that relationship moving forward. Of course, that can change over time. It can flip-flop back and forth, but that's the current state of the relationship. When we look at the socio-psychological tradition, we looked at the theorist Mary Ann Fitzpatrick, who talked about the relational schema of family. You have to look at what you know about relationships in general, and then what you know about family relationships, and then what you know about your relationship with your family. Those are the first three things that we look at when looking at family relationships. After these schemas are established, we look at our family and we evaluate how intimate our family is, how individual each member of our family is, and the factors that are external to the family, such as family friends or the distance our family lives. Are we do our home bases in different parts of America, or outside? Is it a global family? And do we work a lot? Is our father always at work? Is our mother always at work? And then other concerns outside of the family that involve sort of how we relate to each other. Then there's another theory within this tradition that looks at the social penetration, and it sort of talks about how couples relate to each other and build relationships through communication. It looks at first how you orient to each other, getting to know sort of how each other are usually in communication, and then it looks at exploratory effective exchanges when you're figuring out kind of how each other prefer to communicate, what's some norms that you have in that relationship. Then you have effective exchange, which is where you've been communicating for a while and you have an understanding of how you typically communicate and you can fall into those patterns. Then there's a stable exchange where roles are established. There's either it's an egalitarian relationship or you have a submissive and a dominant person in the relationship, and that's an understood kind of path of moving forward. And then in the sociocultural tradition, we look at identity management, which is kind of how we manage what people perceive about us. How do we hold up our image, Is it, are you presenting yourself by how you speak? Do you talk to people in a way that lets them know that you're dominant over them and that's your identity? Do you let people know what you value in life? How are your values and beliefs expressed as part of your identity, and how you communicate with other people? What are you telling people or presenting in your appearance or the way you speak that tells people a little bit about who you are? Yeah, those are some of the theories, the basic theories about in chapters 5 and 6 this week. I found it pretty interesting, and I think it related a lot to sociology, which I had some background knowledge of. So I really enjoyed this week.